Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. This is exciting. We have an example of how the principles of shared practices of acquisitions can work in a completely different market, in an international market that we weren't attempting to reach, but we had a listener and she reached out and said, "Hey, I want to make this work. I want to be a practice owner." So you are in for a treat today. We're going to talk about the differences between our country and dentistry and hers, and I won't spoil it for you now. Enjoy this interview from Dr. Meredith Gay. Welcome to the Shared Practices podcast. This is a special episode because we are reaching out of our normal geography here. We have a listener who reached out to us almost 2 years ago now. It seems like, with some questions about like, "Hey, I'm listening to your show. Does this work elsewhere? And how can I get more information?" And all of a sudden, we had a listener in Australia who was buying a dental practice using the information from our podcast and from our course. And I've been following her journey all along, and she's been keeping me updated. Dr. Meredith Gay, welcome.
Hi, Richard. It's exciting to be here.
Well, time zone wise, I was up late last night speaking to a dentist from Canada, from Vancouver, and now here we are talking across the world. You've just put your kids to bed. I've woken up and there's everyone's asleep, and my fingers are crossed that they stay asleep, but we might get interrupted here. So just a fair warning.
No worries. All good.
Well, so this is exciting. So I want to hear your journey to practice ownership, and what that looked like for you, and what were the key moments that helped you decide, you know what, hey, I want to be a practice owner. How do I do this? And then since then, we can talk about your journey with leadership, your journey with culture, and even some of the similarities and differences with practice models and opportunities in Australia versus the US. So start us off at the beginning. Tell us about your background in dentistry and your journey to practice ownership.
Okay. Well, I graduated end of 2011 and
Okay.
got a job, pretty much had a job lined up with a practice I'd been dental nursing at while I was at dental school, and started there sort of Christmas of the same year. Worked there while I had two kids, because I had full books and everything else. I didn't want to change anything. And then once I was ready to come back full time, needed to make a decision about whether or not I wanted to still be doing the commute of 1 to 2 hours, depending on traffic each day.
Which is
Um,
just brutal. You're talking about,
yeah,
young kids, and then you've got a 1 to 2 hour commute on each end. That eats your
yeah.
entire day. That's a hard schedule.
Yeah, and it was getting like kids don't always sleep as well and long drives. So I was wanting to either move closer to home or work something out. So, but 2 hours works really good for listening to podcasts.
There you go.
Silver linings. Yeah, so then I was looking at moving closer to home, and I needed to make a decision between buying a practice or associating. And if I did do an associateship, I was probably going to lock myself out of pretty much my whole area. So I'm on the northern beaches of Sydney, which is kind of like a big strip. So a good 5-10K radius lockout would have pretty much locked me out of my whole area in an associateship contract. So I needed to kind of make that decision before I moved, which was when I found your podcasts. So, and started listening to them and was like, yep, I think this ownership thing is for me.
Nice.
Yeah, especially when I had listened to that one of your early ones that was saying that, you know, an associateship isn't safe just because, you're not committed to a practice. You're at the whim of everybody else's decisions.
Mm.
And that was probably one of those things that I was noticing at my old practice. So, and that, being a mum, you had a couple of people and that were like new mums that were like, yeah, it totally works. It gives you the freedom to be at your kid's school and, work-life balance and all the rest of it. So I decided that, it was for me. So something very strange for Australia. I did what you guys were saying, and I sent an email out to all the local dental practices and just saying, look, I moved to the area. I've got 2 kids. This is going to be my home, and I would love a practice if anybody was looking at retiring. And a couple of people reached out, and the practice I ended up buying, he reached out to me really early on, and we got on like a house on fire. We were very similar in how we treated patients and talked to patients. And so then it just sort of snowballed from there. In between January and September, it just it had its ups and downs. Don't get me wrong. It was not exactly smooth
Sure.
sailing, but it all worked out. And I ended up with a relocated practice, which was probably one of those things I think I'd heard was a big no-no from everybody, but it ended up working out okay. Relocated practice
What do you
in
mean by
September.
so you
It
bought
was
it
in an
and then
old
moved?
house. No, it was in an old house, and he had sold the old house and the land, and he was in the process of moving the practice when I started talking to him. So the deal was he moved it, and the day we opened at the new place, I took ownership. So we both worked on the plans as well, which was nice. So there were a few things that he'd had drawn up that I was like, oh, I want to change. So he let me change them. I paid for those changes. Like I wanted an OPG room, bigger staff room, things like that. And so we kind of both put in money and did it, and a bit of commitment on either side without actual like a full contract, but it worked
Wow.
out. So we're in a brand new kind of practice, and here we are 9 months in now.
Well,
So
so let's go back a few steps here. So, you said, going off market and not using a broker is pretty weird for Australia. You said, you sent out emails.
yeah.
You had an email list of these dentists. How did you even get the list of emails?
So I reached out to a couple of a specialist and a couple of dentists that were in the local study group that I had
Mm,
actually done some aid work during university with. And I'd spoken to them and sort of, was saying, look, how do you know anyone? How do you think it's a good idea? Like, can you give me some guidance on it? And one of them was in the committee and was like, well, I like you. I think you're a great person, so I'm happy to help. Why don't you write an email and I'll send it out to our membership?
okay.
So so he sent it out to the local area membership, and so it got out that way. But everyone I'd ever spoken to had always bought through a broker or had been a partner, been an associate that brought in. I'd never heard of anybody doing a flyer or an
Right.
email. Yeah. So when I tell my friends that I did that, they're like, oh my gosh, where did you hear that? And I was like, oh, shared practices.
So, speaking of that, what applied and what didn't apply from the advice that we're giving, from the course? You got the ownership accelerator and you were applying that and reading through the book, and um, what did you have to like translate for your market and the way that dental practices are versus in the US?
Like a lot of it was similar. So like when you were looking at locations and things like that, looking at highways and um thoroughfare areas and all that sort of stuff, still all correlated. Reaching out to brokers probably didn't correlate as well. We're a lot smaller market, so we've only really got one or two dental real estate kind of website groups.
Okay.
And I went to a couple of them that most people had kind of put their practices for sale on. But we didn't have that big sort of area that you could ring people and say, oh, is there anything for sale in this area? It was just all kind of on one or two websites.
Right.
The biggest thing probably was going through numbers. Like our healthcare system is totally different. So when you guys were talking about all the different type of practices and whether or not you accepted health fund, those sorts of things, that wasn't applicable at all. Ours is totally different. So that confused me no end at the start.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we're like, here's all these helpful numbers. You're like, none of this is helpful
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. And when you guys were talking about, oh, you need to work out if you want like a private clinic or this, I'd be trying to work out which one would correlate more into how we run dentistry here. Because we are more health funds or just private. So,
Okay.
And the
You're
health fund.
is the health funds, is that like the national, like Medicaid for us is like the plan that people are on, if they're, like on the national plan or the state plan versus like I know in Canada, for instance, where I was born, um, there is no, like, private or there's no public what do we socialized dentistry. Like, dentistry
Yeah.
is outside the healthcare system, so it's
Yeah.
still private.
Yeah. So we have private and public dentistry, but public dentistry is done in dental hospitals. So we've
Okay.
got dental clinics run by the by the health department, and they run those. They do give out vouchers and stuff for people, like if you're affiliated that way, but generally you go to the like hospital for dental health if you're on like a healthcare card or anything like that. And then otherwise it's just private, and it's either you pay up front or we use a what we call high caps. We swipe health fund cards and they pay the rebate, and then you just pay the gap if you've got a health fund. And that's
Okay.
generally how most of our practices work. They're all private.
Okay. So the way
And
less
gaps,
insurance dependent than we are in the US.
yeah. Yeah. So if you don't have insurance, you go to the dental hospital and you get free dental.
Okay.
So a bit of a wait list, but yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. So the, supply and demand, the options for people are different. And then you also mentioned before the call, hygiene is different. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it's growing here, but our hygiene department is really weird, like different. Most of the time, all our dentists we do our own scale and cleans, checkups, all that sort of stuff. So when you guys were talking about how much our hygiene department would correlate to a successful practice for growth, it didn't work the same. So I'd look at how many scale and cleans they did because I still used it for like how much work you would be generating out of that.
Right.
But we didn't have like that whole separate area. So, but I've been talking to a few friends that have worked with them, and I'm pretty keen to maybe try it out. So, but it's a mind shift. People here are used to seeing a dentist.
So the dentist does their own hygiene. So I mean, essentially, you operate out of one chair. Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
accurate for most dentists in Australia?
Yeah. Yeah. So we
So
have one chair and we just do everything.
you don't have a hygienist, you're not jumping back and forth between multiple chairs. It's like you and the assistant and
Yeah.
someone at the front desk, a single dentist in an office would just be them, one assistant, someone at the front desk, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but at the same time, the practice that you bought, it's more than just you. So talk to us about
Yeah.
that.
So one of the things from listening to the podcast, and I came from a big practice. So I came from a 5 that became 6 chair practice,
Mm.
which is pretty big for Australia. We generally don't go much more above 2 or 3. So five to 6 chairs is pretty big.
And
Um,
so that would be 5 to 6 dentists because
yeah.
there's no hygienist.
Yeah, yeah. So that practice didn't have a hygienist either, even with all those chairs. So it was just six dentists just working sort of all together.
Yeah.
So I wanted a bigger practice. I didn't want a 1 or 2 chair. I wanted 3 or more. In all my searching, I never came up with anything bigger than a 3 chair.
Okay.
So I got a 3 chair, and we've currently got 4 generals, and then 3 other dentists that come in and do kind of a bit more specialty stuff. So implants, oral surgery, like Wizzy extractions, pediatrics, and a bit of ortho.
Okay. So you've
Yeah.
got some how many full-time dentists, how many part-time dentists kinda working out of chairs at different points of time in your office?
So I generally have three to 2 dentists on every day. My aim is to get 3 chairs going constantly.
Hmm.
So yeah. So at this point, we're three dentists 3 days, and then 2 dentists the other 3. But
Okay.
we're growing, so hopefully it'll be 3 by 3 pretty soon.
No, and that's just, like, an amazing I'm trying to wrap my brain around this, and I'm trying to even, like, the hygiene, are there hygienists in Australia? Like, is that a thing? Like,
Yeah,
can you even
it
find
is. Yeah, no, you can. And it's a growing thing. So we've got hygienists and we've got therapists.
Okay.
So oral health therapists can actually do like fillings on kids, extractions on kids, scaling claytons, all that sort of stuff, place ortho brackets and all that extra stuff, where the hygienists more just do the cleans and things like that. So we've got two streams. But there are, yeah, definitely hygienists because, as I said, I've worked with spoken to a couple of people that have got hygienists, and it's so funny because we're all like, oh, what do you mean? You run in and out of your room in between patients? Like, how does that work? So,
Oh, I love
yeah,
it.
that part just blows out. I'm like, do you have like allocated time? How does it work? But I think
Yeah.
it's a growing thing. I think it'll be in the next couple of years, it may take off. Like, yeah, and just be the normal. But it's just
Well,
a change of mindset for patients
right,
too.
and you might have to the issue is, um, the number of chairs. I mean, as soon as you switch to a hygiene model, the idea of a hygiene model is that you've got 2 or 3 chairs of hygiene going and then 1 or 2 chairs of doctor production going. Um, you can just get a lot more dentistry done, and you're doing less of it, and you're doing, more of the concentrated stuff that only the dentist can do and that you can bill a little bit more for. Um, so it's exciting, and, I'm excited to see if you kinda, get into this on the cutting edge of Australia's hygiene wave here. So, that's awesome. So, okay, so what, lessons do you have that definitely applied from the podcast on the transition? What was, helpful? What would you pass along to someone else? Say that we've got another listener on the other side of Australia who's like, "Okay, I wanna do this too. Dr. Gay, she's doing it." So, what would you tell people about the transition?
um, Make sure you have a good lawyer. Don't skimp on that part. Um,
Yeah.
just I think that last two, like, it seemed like everything was going really slowly, and then that last 2 weeks just was trying to organize the transition and get the final legal documents through, get the bank loans through. Um, and because we didn't have a broker, it was very, I would definitely recommend anyone not going through a broker. Like, it was so much smoother doing it dentist to dentist.
Mm,
Um, but it did make for those awkward discussions. Like, you had to just, put it on the table and just say, no, I'm not happy with this. I want this. But at the same time, be very aware, like your podcasts have said multiple times, like, you can't burn the dentist you're buying off because you
mm.
need his goodwill. So that was probably the biggest balancing act I found with the transition, was keeping the old dentist happy, but not feeling like I was losing out or paying more than I wanted to. Um, and then having a good lawyer, I thought really worked well with that, because they would talk through their lawyer a little bit, and it took out that awkward conversation a little bit. Like, I'd bring up, oh, I'm not really happy with this. Can we just have a tweak of it? And my lawyer would then send it. And then their lawyer would write back. So it kind of made it less personal, but it was still amicable without having to sit there and be like, oh, I don't know what's going on. Like, I think if our lawyers weren't so on it, we would have ended up having disagreements about more things than what we did.
So your lawyers kinda acted a little bit like your brokers in
Yeah.
okay, which is
Yeah.
great, and keeping that seller dentist happy was especially important for you because he's now working with you, right?
Yeah, yeah. So he was working 4 days a week for the first 6 months, and he's dropped to three. And my plan is for him to stay on for as long as possible.
Nice.
His patients love him, and he's just slowly dropping down days. He will retire eventually. Um, but that slow transition, it's helped with um, patients, because a lot of them, we changed a lot of things, like the look, the location.
You bought as you were moving from an old house
Yeah,
to this shiny
medi-
new dental clinic.
yeah, and it's like in a big medical sort of tower kind of thing. So it's, not an old garden. It's like all glass and totally different. And a lot of the patients do say, they're like, oh, is he still here? And I'm like, yeah, he's in the front room. Like, Yep, he's not going anywhere.
Right.
He and I are just to get like doing this together. So I kind of really sold it as a partnership to start with to the
Nice.
patients, like, oh yeah, we're doing this together. We've moved it, and so that they didn't sort of. We even changed the name, so
Mhm.
we changed everything. So
Which, is important when, we talk about the name of the practice being the name of the dentist, that just kinda locks you in for a rough
yeah,
transition or, a moment in time where you're like, "Okay, well, now it's been this old doctor's name for forever. What's the magic moment where we switch it?" Um,
yeah, yeah. So we ended up putting a lot of stuff up that's like Dr. Michael Johns and Dr. Meredith Gay, like at Beach's Dental Monoval. Like
mm,
that was our big tagline. So we still threw his name into a lot of things. And now we'll slowly try and take it out because, yeah, he is the practice. Like he was is and was sort of the practice. So
you're the practice now.
I am. And it's growing and it's working. But yeah, it just had to really be, that was really important, that smooth transition, not to scare patients away, sort of like, oh, it's new, it's shiny, it's got a new name, because they still sort of go, oh, is this so and so's practice still? And it's like, yep, it is.
Yeah.
So
Okay, cool. So you did a lot in that transition. And then, of
yeah.
course,
Rules.
uh
What was the rule? Like, do nothing for the first 3 months, and I
right,
changed a fair bit, but it did work because of the move. It
right.
was like new, and we sold it like that, like new location, new name, same friendly spaces, like,
Nice.
so we just kind of did it all at the start.
So, one of the things I've always worried with the podcast is that we would oversell ownership in season 1 and season 2 and what we talk about, and then someone gets into it and either they buy the wrong practice or it just wasn't as financially or, career-wise, the stress, all of that, as worth it. Do you feel like on the backside of it now, originally you were looking at, work-life balance, family issues. I'm sure there's some financial issues in there as well of like, as an associate versus as an owner. So did we oversell it for you? Is it working out other than COVID? Let's pretend that COVID didn't happen.
Yeah, look, I'm happy with my decision. It's definitely been a roller coaster, and it's not easy by any means. Like I generally will do my dental day, get home, do dinner with the kids, read the stories, put them to bed, and then jump on the computer and start working again for another couple of hours on paperwork and shift, like that sort of stuff. So it's definitely a hard work, but I think you kind of sold that like in the podcast as well. I didn't get into it like, not thinking it was going to be a heck of a ride,
Okay.
but so no, look, I'm happy. And as it's like, I think we were talking before, like I look back at what I thought my end goals were. And about 6 months in, I'm like, nope, let's change those a little bit. And like, I don't think you ever know what you're getting into until you get into it.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
And then
Um,
it changes.
yeah. And then you think you've got it and it changes. Like, yep, we finally got it. And like, your practice manager leaves or somebody retires or something else happens, and it's always sort of like you get a couple of steps ahead and then there's a little bit of a bump in the road and then you keep going, but it's definitely, I think, been more ups than downs.
Awesome. No, that's good to hear, and I'm glad that we, you know, paired the pros and the cons together, and we're able to kind of pitch all that so that you weren't expecting to have a easy sailing ride without any bumps. Uh, so we're now in a season on leadership culture and change,
Yeah,
and I wanted to talk to you about the transition in yourself of, being a producer dentist, you show up, you do your dentistry, you go home, versus being a leader and and how you've had to grow, if there's been any learning curve there, if there's been any mistakes in your, leadership, and
yeah, there's been
interesting
plenty.
and interesting to me is, with a single doc practice in the States, there's kind of a clinical team of the hygienists and the assistants and the front desk, all kind of based around this one provider. But you've kind of got a more one-to-one ratio of, like, dentist to did you call them dental nurses instead of dental
Yeah.
assistants?
Either or, dental assistant, dental nurse. Yeah.
Okay. So
Both the same.
it's more like half your team is dentists, half your team is assistants, and then you've
Yeah.
got, maybe 1 or 2 people up at the front desk running the
Yeah.
front.
Yeah. And
So
then plus steri nurse and everything else. So what? Yeah.
okay. So there is
So
like an extra assistant who kinda, like, floats and sterilizes
yeah.
everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I
So talk
can't
to us
with
about
three.
that.
It's too much. Yeah. So if I've got three dentists on, I'll have three dentists, three assistants, a steri nurse, and two receptionists, and a practice manager that
Mm.
floats kind of doing extra stuff. Which yeah, so there's the big team on like certain days. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
1-to-1. So I generally rotate the nurses through. Um, we all work with different ones kind of on different days just so that everybody gets a bit of variety, but you still kind of have your nurse a little bit. Um, I found that the associates and I as an associate like to have my nurse because you sort of work with that person. But I found with the transition as an owner, it was actually really good to have a different nurse every day, more for staffing, so that it didn't not necessarily seem like you had a favorite, but that they would then start to feel comfortable because you just, you chat with your nurse all day while you work. That then you'd have a day just chatting, finding out about that nurse and getting their opinions on things you've changed. And so I really made the effort that I would have a different nurse every day, whereas the associates kind of got to keep a single nurse so that they got a bit more, I guess, smoother with their workflow.
sure.
But,
No,
but yeah,
and that makes sense too, where, you're trying to get a pulse on where are these people at with the whole transition, with, their ideas, with their complaints. So as an owner, that's a lot of face time with each of these people versus if you're like, okay, no, I just want my one assistant. You guys have your assistants. You'd never get to know these people quite as well, especially in your situation where you could do that. You could say,
yeah.
you know, split everyone up and everyone stays in their lane, and, so, getting FaceTime with everyone, um, so that you can lead and train and work with everyone, it sounded like it was a part of your leadership.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think it really fostered so a lot of the culture that we have, like the practice had a really, really good bones, like really long-term staff that had been there. Like some of them have been there 25 years, like
Oh, wow.
really long-term staff. Um, and coming in as that new person, working there beforehand really helped. So just doing a bit of an associate role, but coming on and then really fitting into it as more of a family team, working with everybody let me kind of do that. Um, it worked out really well and it was really lovely. And then like a lot of them are a little bit older, and I really feel like some of them took me under their wing and got like really mama bear protective about like, making this work for me. Like I had two kids that I brought into the practice on occasions. And they really like, this was my big decision. Like this was me trying, and they were really, really all pulled together to make it work.
Cool.
Um, which was really lovely. And that would be our biggest culture thing, is like we are a sort of a big family. Like we help each other out. Our patients come first. And they all know most of our practice, like patients, because they've, been patients of the practice for like 20 years. So it kind of just fitted in really well.
Well, and that's huge. I mean, in a transition like you've had where the seller is staying on, you've got these long-standing team members that have a ton of experience, that know the patients know them. The fact that you've been able to, like, get everyone on your side, and, where they're rooting for you, you're not this new boss that's coming in and it's like, "Okay, we're gonna change things and, I'm in charge now." But you've been able to do this smoothly, um, with well,
As smooth as change happens, but yeah.
on the surface, it sounds like you're doing it swimmingly. So, uh, how what advice would you have for someone who is thinking about a transition like this, where they're keeping on the seller? And so, a lot of times, team members look at the seller as, like, the source of authority, you know, because 'cause they're the ones who previously have made the decisions, for all these years. So, how did you handle that transition in leadership with the seller still there?
I think I was really hands-on. Like, I wanted to know how Steri worked. I wanted to know all our processes. When we were moving, I was carrying boxes, packing things away, saying, like, this, we're gonna change how, like, we're gonna centralize all our stock and we're not gonna have it all in all the rooms. And everybody was kind of like, oh, we weren't all on board for certain changes. But I think I kind of picked and chose my battles a little bit, and I
Mm,
picked the things that I thought would work. And a few things that I'd heard people saying, like, oh, I don't like going into so and so's room to get such and such. And I was like, well, look, we're going to centralize it. And, that way you just come to the back room and that's where everything is. And I picked the things I wanted to change and kind of made sure they were the things that I knew would work really well. And so even though we had a bit of resistance to change, when they worked, it was kind of like, oh, actually, yeah, it's a bit annoying now, but it does work and now we're used to it. So it made then that role of change easier for the then things that I wasn't so sure on, that I thought, I hadn't seen work but had heard on the podcast, or I'd heard and wanted to do change and things like that. So being hands-on meant that if anybody had a question, I generally would know the answer. Like, what do we do if the audit club says this? I was like, oh, it means such and such. And, I got in and I learned everybody's role, kind of thing.
okay.
So that if someone had a question, I asked them to, like, why did I have to change? I was like, oh, well, I knew the reasoning why. It wasn't just because I was telling them why.
Right. No, that's huge. Your willingness to jump in there and, um, learn everyone, the ins and outs of everything. So rather than like, "Oh, that's not my problem, figure it out," you could come from a place of authority and of understanding, and you could explain and get people on board, and at the same time, selectively, I think probably being that close to everything allowed you to decide which things are worth changing, because you were in there and you saw the problems and, the areas where it didn't flow or it didn't work. Um, did you, looking back, um, are there areas of growth that you've had in terms of leadership? What have you had to learn, or are there mistakes that you've made that now looking back, you're like, "Oh, I could have done that differently." But hindsight's 2020.
Oh, yeah, heaps of things. And then I think one of the biggest things is like learning when to push and then to hold back. And like when something when something had bothered me and I'd pick up and I'd be like, we need to change this. I've learned that there are some things that you just, it's better to let it slide. It's not a huge problem. It's not going to impact patient care or productivity or cost. And that just makes the staff happier. And it's
Mm.
easier just to have happy staff some days than to worry about the fact that I don't like the process of something.
Right.
And that I can't micromanage everything. So, and just to let it go, like have the happy staff, happy day, and everything runs smoother in its own right.
Well, and I think especially in acquisitions that the difference between a system or a process that's, um, I just said process like a Canadian or Australian, um,
I'm rubbing off on you.
instead of process. So the difference between something that's, like, good enough, that's like an 80% process that gets the job done, but that's the way they've been doing it versus, uh, something that shared practices sometimes does to people is they hear what's possible and like, "Oh, well, if
Yeah,
we did it this way, it could be this much more efficient," and the gained efficiency of that 20%, but if you burn all the bridges and everyone's unhappy and you spend 6 months training and following up on this one little thing, is it truly worth it? So it sounds like picking your battles has
yeah,
been something you've mostly done right, occasionally done wrong, and learned from the times that you've struggled with that.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and
Okay.
just letting things go. Like great ideas that you're like, oh, you know what? I'll just put it in the bank and I'll revisit this, in 12 months or, you know, things like that. So
Okay, cool. Well, to wrap this up, what would you tell someone in a similar situation like you that previously maybe wasn't thinking about ownership and now, even though this last year has been a crazy year, it being worth it for you, um, was this a leap of faith for you to kinda jump in all of this, or did you feel like, "Oh, no, I got this. This is gonna be no big deal?"
I think I felt I had like I listened to hours of your podcast and I did the course and I did everything. And then I guess one of the other things I did was I think, and that was why I reached out to you early on. I was after a mentor and I was like,
Yeah.
did you know anybody? I ended up getting myself a mentor through our accounting firm. They have a what do they call it? A business improvement solutions team.
Mm,
And I got myself a mentor through them. And David has totally helped me out with that. And he's really sort of, I think the biggest thing, once I bought the practice, you guys set me up for all that. And then having that soundboard to change me from being an associate who just came to work to being an owner, bouncing ideas off him and coming through that has been so important. Um, yeah, no, that was probably one of the best things I got out of the podcast as well, was how important it was to have a mentor.
yeah,
Um,
and
and
and coaching, having a coach, having a mentor, having someone that has a perspective that understands and knows your situation, but then also has some distance and some perspective to it is something that you just can't get without someone who's invested in you and your success and what you've got going on, and when you're in the heat of it, when you're in that moment, you've got your perspective, and it's so hard to stand back, so it sounds like you found that person for you.
yeah, no, totally. Yeah, that idea of being able to be like, and for them to have that not emotional tie so much. Like, look, I know you really want this, but it's not big game. Like, this is our end goal. Let this one go, and
Right.
we'll still get there without so many roller coaster rides.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
So
this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for reaching out to us a while ago, for listening to the show, and then, for being willing to come on and share your experience, and it's exciting to hear that, while there are some differences in dentistry and, between insurance and hygienists and all that stuff, that the core principles you still were able to take these and make it happen and find an off-market practice. I'm just gonna
yeah,
email a bunch of dentists and we're gonna find a practice to buy and here you are now. So, thank you for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
anytime. Thank you for having me.
Well, awesome. Well, if someone wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way? Facebook or email or, if they're in Australia and you're like, "Hey, I need a mentor or advice on how to do this here."
Yeah, no, totally. Email's probably my easiest one. So
What are you okay if we say it on the show? If not, that's okay.
yeah, Meredith at beachesdentalmonaval.com.au.
Okay, perfect, and hopefully we can get that in the show notes. I'll
Yeah.
make a note to John to listen to that at the end and add that in. So, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for getting up early.
Yeah, of course. Hey, take care. We'll see you.
See ya.
Okay, I love first off, thank you, Meredith, for coming on the show. I loved her accent. I loved her stories, and I didn't realize how different dentistry was in Australia. But at the same time, the principles applied. I don't even know if this was in the interview or afterwards that we were talking about how some of her friends were looking at buying single operatory practices, as that's pretty normal there, and she took the principles of shared practices and said, "No, I don't wanna buy the smallest practice possible. I wanna buy the biggest practice where I can reproduce the production, and we've got a healthy base of patients and a business here." And she didn't have a perfect blueprint, but she had the determination and the desire to get exactly what she wanted. and very impressed with her journey, with her sharing her experience. So hopefully you enjoyed that. That if we have any other Australian listeners who are looking at some advice or some guidance or some connections and resources, 100% reach out to her. She was very gracious to offer that. Thank you all for listening, and we will talk with you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.